Good afternoon, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. Thanks for joining us for the launch of a new series, which we're calling Rising Stars in Illinois Politics, in which we feature some new and rising leaders in our state. And we're delighted, to launch a series with a terrific state representative from the Chicago area, Representative Margaret Croke, who has been serving in the Illinois General Assembly for several years. Very interesting background. She grew up in Oak Park, attended the University of Michigan, where she studied political science, came back to Illinois, and then began a number of really interesting government jobs, worked for the Cook County Commissioner, worked in Secretary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign, worked for Mayor Emanuel, then also worked on Governor Pritzker's initial campaign. He was elected. She worked on his transition and then became the deputy chief of staff for the Illinois Department of Commerce. And then, as I mentioned earlier, in 2020, she ran for a seat in the Illinois General Assembly, won, and has been serving for several years, is involved in a lot of interesting and important issues. And we're delighted to be chatting with her. She's joining us from her home in Chicago. So, Representative, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Great. Well, you grew up in Oak Park, which is kind of a storied community in Chicago. Tell us a little bit about growing up there and just sort of the interests you had, as you were going through school. Were you always sort of bitten by the political bug?
Yeah, so Oak Park was definitely I loved growing up in Oak Park. I joke, it's actually the People's Republic of Oak Park. It's kind of a liberal utopia, to the point where when I went to the University of Michigan, which is an incredibly liberal school as well, I was taken aback by like some of the opinions and perspectives of my my peers. I was like, I'm sorry, I thought we were over on this side of the left, and you're kind of like in the middle. There's some Republicans here. I've never really met a Republican other than my father. So it was definitely a great place to grow up. I do disagree with Hemingway when he says big lawns, small minds. We've got smaller lawns than you'd expect, and bigger minds than you'd expect. But I did not have the political bug whatsoever growing up. My parents are not in politics, which definitely, if we're all familiar with like the Nepo baby craze, I was not a Nepo baby when it came to politics. I did not get into that whole world, I would say, until college a little bit. And then even then, it was much more post-college. With you kind of mentioned all my jobs that I had with my career trajectory. So,
well, tell us about Michigan. I mean, it's obviously a remarkable school. How you happened to go there and what your experience was, and particularly your focus in political science. Was that initially what you planned, or did it just get some good classes and professors that directed you in that place?
I grew up going to Southwest Michigan for my summers in New Buffalo, so was familiar with the state. And then my mom grew up in Jackson, Michigan, which is famously known for its prison. So her father was a judge, and my grandparents also went to the University of Michigan. So it's a little bit of a family tie there. Politics at Michigan, it's very theoretical. It's very ideological. You're studying a lot about kind of what's happened in the past, and how to maybe utilize some of the theories that you're given in today's political climate. But it's definitely hard, I would say, to apply some of the things that I learned in political science in college to my career. And I don't know if they necessarily, I would not say that a political science degree very much equates to being a politician or an elected official. I was interested in going into law, and I think that maybe political science in that way translates more to a career in law than it does to like what we think of the natural practical application is for a political science degree.
So when you finished up at Ann Arbor and you came back to Chicago, were you looking for a position in the government? Because I think your first job was with the Cook County Commissioner Bridget Gaynor? Was it just, something, an opportunity came up and you just decided to plunge in, or was there a strategic plan in place?
Oh gosh, I wish I could say that I was strategic. It was 100% just a fate and chance. My first job was actually at Sidley Austin, which is a large law firm, has a significant office, or a large office in Chicago. And I met my husband there, who was very involved in political fundraising. And I went with him and met Commissioner Bridget Gaynor, and I fell in love with her. She's still my mentor to this day. And she had a office opening. So instead of going to law school, I decided to start working for the commissioner. And that's kind of how your jobs, in my experience, politics work. There's not a lot of posting online. There's a little bit more now for kind of some of the larger positions, but it's a lot of, do you get that entry level job? And then are you able to use that as a jumping off point to other opportunities? So I very much fell into the lap of politics and started at 23 years old being an executive assistant. And, 8 years later, here we are.
Well, tell us about working on Secretary Clinton's campaign in 2016. Were you focused in Illinois, the Midwest, or was it more kind of an issues or constituent-based position?
For Hillary Clinton, it was I was a regional field director, so it was very much Illinois-based, which I loved because that gave me the ability to speak to constituents and stakeholders across the state, which I normally would stick very much to the north side of Chicago, where I'm from, or where I live now. So having that field experience was great because that's kind of the basis of all politics. I would argue that I still believe field in almost any campaign is the most important aspect of a campaign. So having that also prepared me to go and do the campaigning I had 2-3 years ago, because when you have to go talk to people who don't necessarily want to talk to you, especially about politics, you're forced in these really uncomfortable situations. And it's amazing if you can start making small talk with people who don't actually share a lot of your values, or maybe you don't assume they share a lot of your values, I would say, how that can prepare you for something else, for another position, another role.
Well, tell us about working in the office of Mayor Emanuel. We had an event with him a couple of years ago, and of course, he's this kind of legendary force of nature. Was that what was that experience like?
I worked in his legislative affairs shop, so I dealt a lot. I actually dealt maybe less with the mayor and more with aldermen, and aldermen are a lot of personalities. You have to build consensus to get anything done in any, unit of government. And that very much applies to the city of Chicago. So I spent a lot of time taking the mayor's messaging and working with the aldermen about why that messaging was the right messaging, why that policy was the right policy, and why they should support the mayor and in his agenda. I loved working in the mayor's office. It was there was an energy there that was incredibly exciting. I'm very passionate about Chicago and Illinois and how much I love it, how much I want to see this state thrive and be the best it can be. And, my whole mantra is making sure that my kids have the best education here, go to school here, and then come back to take care of me here. So having that goal, and with a mayor who is also as equally passionate, it was very thrilling. It was a really exciting time.
Well, tell us about working on the Pritzker campaign. What was that like? And was it also very field focused? I know you you were the women's outreach director, I believe.
Yeah, so it was less field. It was much more political. So I dealt with, instead of dealing with voters or constituents or kind of the grassroots groups, I dealt with more politicians or formal Democratic organizations or formal women's groups, a lot of pro-choice groups for our campaign. We engaged them. It was a little bit more taking an issue that the governor or then candidate was had on their platform and figuring out who could be a speaker on that, who could represent that in our support group. So the field side though of Clinton definitely prepared me for JB's campaign. I actually got the job. I got the job obviously because I'm great, but also because my boss on JB's campaign was my boss on Hillary Clinton. So he knew that I was capable, that I enjoyed talking with people, that I enjoyed working incredibly long hours for very little pay. And he was like, I would like you to work on this other campaign for us, for this candidate who we don't really know if he's got a great shot, but he's a great guy and he can fund his campaign. So come on over. And I'm really glad I did, because I think I was one of first of 20 people hired. I was there for 2 years on that campaign, or a year and a half. And definitely the relationships I built and the people I met I would not have been afforded that opportunity had I not worked on a statewide campaign.
Well, then after the transition, you became deputy chief of staff for the Illinois Department of Commerce, obviously a hugely important agency. Talk about that experience. Was this more the mechanics of running a big government department that you were focused on?
100%. I didn't know what I wanted to do after the JB campaign. And unfortunately for a lot of us politicos, when we have on our resumes a million different campaigns and political offices and government offices, a lot of private companies don't really know what to do with us. They're wondering what our hard skills are. They're wondering what our knowledge base is. And for me, going into the Department of Commerce, I felt like that would round out my career experience, it would round out my knowledge, and I could focus on some of the ways that government interacts with businesses, also how government, invests in communities, because DCO is one of only 8 agencies that does grant making. We lovingly call it the cash cow. I lovingly called it the dumpster fire at times, because sometimes when a legislator doesn't know what to do with a program, they just throw it at DCEO and we figure it out. So it was definitely a learning experience. And it also allowed me to meet people, because this is also my focus, is relationship building. I was able to relationship build with a whole group of individuals and business leaders that were not open to me prior to that experience. So that was the goal with DCEO. And I feel like it did give me a lot of legitimacy on my campaign 2 years later.
Well, let's talk about that campaign, because you ran in 2020. There was actually there was an incumbent Democrat who had actually just recently been appointed, as I recall. But still, tell us about the decision to take the plunge. I mean, do you remember going to the first door and knocking and saying, "Hey, I'm running for state rep"? I mean, talk about that, launching a campaign and what that's like.
Yeah, launching a campaign can be the scariest thing in the entire world. So the first thing you have to do in Illinois is get your petition signatures. So and because of the 12th district, I'll give a little background. I represent the Gold Coast, Lincoln Park, Old Town, and East Lakeview. And my district runs along the lakefront. So for the students who are familiar with Chicago and you're driving on Lakeshore Drive, which is in the district, I have a lot of condos, a lot of high rises. It's a very dense district, and geographically it's incredibly small. So my ability to actually knock doors was very limited. I had to do a lot of standing outside a coffee shop, bothering people on the sidewalk, because only 8% of my district is considered walkable. So I had to go up to a lot of people and just throw myself in their face. Luckily, I was 8 months pregnant. So people are very nice to a pregnant lady. I also brought my dog. People are also very nice to people who have dogs. And I spent a month getting these petition signatures, and it allowed me to very much fine tune my pitch, because I'm talking to someone where I have about 5 seconds to convince them just to sign a piece of paper with their name. And people are so they're very hesitant right now, I feel like, to provide that information or to endorse a political candidate, even just getting them on the ballot. So that was my first experience. But I also had to convince myself that, at 8 months pregnant, I was going to be having a baby very soon, my first child, that this is what I wanted to do and that I was the best person for the job. So a lot of reaching out to people, a lot of figuring out, is there an opening for me? And luckily there was.
Well, what about fundraising? Was that a tough, I know that's a big part of the business, and I've heard more people, Paul Simon famously said it was the hardest part of the job for him to call up people and ask for support, even though, he was passionately convinced that what he was doing was for the public good. I mean, how was that for you?
Yeah, fundraising is, I would argue, probably the worst part of the job. But it's a necessary evil in the role. And I had to raise $400,000 in 3 months. I had a very expensive race. That's one of the more, and that's individual fundraising. I didn't have support of the Democratic Party at the time. So I was not receiving, millions of dollars from Michael Madigan to run my race. I do live in probably one of the more affluent districts in the state. So there was a lot of individual giving that I was able to tap into. And because I had been around in politics and my husband had been a bundler for a while for various politicians, I knew where to start. That's very rare for a candidate. It was almost like an unfair advantage I had, but the fundraising was quite difficult. I did eventually get support from the governor, who decided to endorse me. So that was incredibly helpful. But I do not love calling people and telling them, like, not only should you vote for me, which is, people feel a duty to vote. They don't necessarily feel a duty to give you cash. And I was also calling around like the Christmas time. So it's a tough sell, but we were able to pull it off. I was very lucky. I was very blessed to be able to convince people that I was the right choice.
Well, so when you go to Springfield for the first time, I mean, did you have kind of a theory of the case in terms of, the issues you wanted to focus on, just how you wanted to organize your time and energy? Or was it just sort of, okay, let me kind of kick the tires for a couple months and then get a more finely honed strategy? Tell us about just how you started it, how you launched, and how you kind of jumped into the job.
Yeah, I knew I wanted to focus kind of my portfolio on two different things. And one of them was anything that really impacts working moms, which I know can be very, is a big topic, but working mothers and young mothers, as well as kind of economic issues. So tax incentives and investment in business, how to get the state on kind of a financial stability track. Because my caucus is blessed with so many people who are incredibly passionate about social issues. So, we've got abortion rights covered. We've got a lot of LGBTQ rights covered. I wanted to focus on that too, in the sense of the kind of the young parent aspect, which was my first bill, because I also represent Boys Town, like a historically LGBTQ community. But I wanted to go in with those kind of two things in the back of my mind. And while I was campaigning, it was constantly brought up to my attention that I was a young mom. How are you going to do this? You're a young mom. Like, who's going to take care of your kids? Very frustrating. I had a state's attorney candidate who was running at the same time, who was a male, who had a kid maybe a month prior to me and never got asked that question about who was taking care of your kids. And it's a reminder every day that there are very few young moms in government. So I have a duty as a young mom to represent them. And a lot of the issues that I deal with, like childcare and like access to, healthcare for my child and the school systems, and literally living that every single day. So that's where my priorities started.
And then the first bill, as I understand it, dealt with fertility coverage to both same-sex couples and single women. Tell us a little bit about your first kind of landmark bill or major bill.
Yeah, I had a constituent reach out to me actually with this concern. So he's a same-sex couple and he was denied IVF coverage for things like sperm collection, or obviously neither him or his partner can carry. And there are situations in which surrogacy it has a contract, and once you're a surrogate, the surrogate's healthcare takes over. It's a somewhat complicated situation, but our fertility coverage was very much limited to a woman who could get pregnant, so someone who could biologically get pregnant, I should say, and that they have unprotected sex for a year to determine that they were infertile. Well, obviously that eliminates a whole population of people. It eliminates LGBTQ individuals. It eliminates specifically, it can eliminate a lesbian couple. Am I going to tell a lesbian couple that they need to go engage in that type of behavior, like to show that they're infertile? It's like, no, of course not. And then it also limited single women, because my argument is that you can be a mother and not a wife. They're not synonymous. A lot of women want to have a child and maybe not, have a partner. So that was the first bill we did. I was surprised how much support on the stakeholder side it garnered. I think people saw that this was a disparity in our insurance care. So I was very excited to get that. It kind of melded everything, as we talk about, like the finances of a home, women, as well as the LGBTQ community.
And actually, I think a bill that you're working on now is called the Pregnancy Expenses Act. Tell us about that, because I know that's actually moving through the General Assembly now.
So I think that we all know in this country that women and mothers tend to bear the economic burden of children much more significantly than fathers or the other parent. So I've seen this personally with close friends of mine. I wanted women to be able to put a stake in the sand when they're pregnant, to make a claim that they want 50% or more of their pregnancy expenses reimbursed, their out-of-pocket insurance costs reimbursed by the other intended parent. We see with like child support, usually that comes after delivery, but delivery and pregnancy expenses are incredibly expensive. I have state insurance, and I just had my second child. I'm pregnant with my third child, and I just paid off my hospital bill. It was over $3,000 just for that hospital bill for that time I spent in Northwestern. That doesn't include all the bills that I've received from my primary care provider or my OBGYN leading up to that point. So it is really expensive. And $3,000, $4,000 just in out-of-pocket medical expenses can be detrimental to a woman's financial stability. So if you don't have insurance, it's also, you're potentially looking at tens of thousands of dollars in just a very healthy pregnancy. So I think it's important that women have that opportunity. And when we're talking about being a pro-choice state, and I'm incredibly pro-choice, that also means being like pro-mother. It means allowing a woman to make a decision about whether or not she wants to have a child and not be faced with that economic burden.
Well, let's talk about another issue that you've been really active in, which is preventing cyberbullying. Talk about the kind of the impetus to plunge into that issue.
So the impetus, again, it was a constituent issue. We've had some children take their lives because of cyberbullying, and I know that as a young mom, like my kid is going to have their social interactions primarily on a cell phone. I grew up with Facebook and MySpace, for anyone who knows MySpace, shout out. And I'm on Instagram. I'm pretty fluent in social media, but there is a generation above me with kids who are in high school who kind of just handed off a cell phone without knowing what could happen. Cyberbullying is incessant. It's 24 hours. It's not relegated to a playground anymore. So the bill that I sponsored is a starting point, and it would require that school administrators, when they are made aware of a cyberbullying incident, they have to notify the parents of the minors involved. Notification, not necessarily investigation right away, but I think notification is so important, because if my son is being bullied, my son is being a bully. I want to take their phone away from them just out of abundance of caution for a period of time so that I can engage in that conversation, because time is of the essence. The decision to take your life as a young adult is very quick. There's not a lot of thought sometimes taken into that decision, and we can just slow it down. I think it'll have some very beneficial. It'll benefit a lot of families and benefit a lot of children.
Okay, great. I know you worked on a Climate and Equity Jobs Act. Talk about, what the state of Illinois can do in the realm of clean energy, combating climate change at the state level.
I think the most important way that Illinois can play into this conversation around climate change is incentivizing actually businesses to want to create green technology, whether that's EVs, electric vehicles, which we've been doing even individual tax incentives around. We want to give the carrot versus the stick. And I think that the carrot does a lot more because there's the potential for obviously profit for these companies, but these new industries to want to come to Illinois to the point where we're diversifying our energy grid so significantly. We could be a model for other states. You look at Texas back in the day, it was like a year ago or whatever, that they completely, their power grid just completely shut down. And that's because of a lack of diversification of their energy. I also would say, the Climate and Equity Jobs Act was a bill that took years, and it required so much input. It required so many working groups and so many legislators putting their touch on that bill. It is the perfect example to me of how good legislation is drafted, because so many people got 80% of what they wanted. And it was able to pass. It was a hard bill to pass, but when you have something that's so impactful, it should take a while. That it's significant policy change for the state of Illinois. But I'm very excited because we're starting to see some parts of the legislation get enacted. And I'm hoping, like I said, that we can be a model for other states and even red states who have traditionally balked at green energy, to see that we're incentivizing companies and businesses to want to come to Illinois to do clean and green energy and create these products. Don't you want some of that revenue?
Well, as I was looking at your bio, I was struck by how many committees you're on. And you're the chair. We'll talk in a second about the Financial Institutions and Licensing Committee, Adoption and Child Welfare, Child Care Accessibility, Gaming, Immigration and Human Rights, Revenue and Finance. Let me just ask you mechanically, with that many committees, how do you organize your time? How do you avoid getting spread out over so many issues that you kind of walk into a committee room and say, "No, what committee am I in right now?"
Yeah, you'll see that there's definitely a theme. There's a theme to my committees, and the theme is that you have kind of the financial side of the state as much as possible, and then a focus on children, early education, families. I think immigration and human rights obviously plays into that whole topic as well. It can be a lot, but different committees have different workloads. So revenue is obviously there are a lot of bills that go to revenue. Not all of them see the light of day. So you have to work with staff to be like, tell me what bills I need to actually pay attention to. Staff is incredibly important too, because, I don't have the capacity to read 20, 50 page bills in 3 weeks even. I've got to make sure that I have kind of these summaries, and then I can refer back to the bill. So that's how I do it. And then also some of the committees you mentioned have lighter workloads. So revenue, very heavy. Immigration is lighter. My committee, Financial Institutions, is lighter, but has like very specific subject matter, which I'm pretty fluent in. And I've focused on banking institutions, cryptocurrency, things like that. So that's how I manage the two.
Well, let's talk for a second about cryptocurrencies, because I know that it's a very important and increasingly important topic also very, very arcane and in some, at least for me, conceptually difficult to get my arms around. Talk about mastering that issue, and then where is that issue now? Because we'd heard it was sort of the surging interest, and then there was one or two big failures, and people started pulling back. So where is the kind of crypto issue now, and how is the state of Illinois involved in it?
Yeah, crypto. The conversation I'm having with people is about smart regulation. So I was a novice at one point and really dove into the crypto conversation. I started with a lot of the true believers in crypto, and we've seen that, unfortunately, for the true believers, that a lot of their theories don't necessarily stand up. Crypto is impacted by the larger financial market and the larger economy. So we need to regulate it. I also argued to a few exchanges and people in the industry that once Larry David started selling cryptocurrency to my grandmother on the Super Bowl, that, this was coming, guys. So we are focused in Illinois about making sure that the good actors are able to continue to do their work. I don't want to eliminate crypto by any means. I'm actually a pretty big crypto advocate. I think it is and crypto and blockchain are two different things. Crypto lives on a blockchain technology. Blockchain, I'm much more of a stronger advocate for, because it has implications for our supply chain and just kind of the way that we structure all of our technological systems for in the long term. But we're focused on making sure good players stay in Illinois. I would argue DRW, Don Wilson, is a great player in the state of Illinois, but also getting away with some of the bad actors. FTX is a great example of, they had a Chicago headquarters, and because of lack of regulation, they were doing things that we know have traditionally been financial crimes for a very long time. They were moving money from one place to another without any type of oversight. Some of the things that these crypto exchanges or companies have done, which we've seen, and they've failed, or they've gone bankrupt, and they've lost all of their crypto, is they're kind of traditional financial schemes. So we need to regulate the industry, and that's what we're doing right now. There's a larger crypto fintech bill that is working its way through the General Assembly that I think addresses a lot of our concerns.
Well, I know you're also active in an important bill called Endow Illinois, which provides tax incentives for community foundations. Talk about that. I know that's an important initiative for you.
Yeah, that's another tax incentive bill. It's it's not a business tax incentive. It's a tax incentive to encourage giving on the local level to endowments. I think it's really important that we figure out ways to continue to sustain our social services and our social service agencies outside of just government funding, because we've seen under Bruce Rauner, when you stop funding social services and you don't have a budget, how the doors of these agencies can close. And that does not mean that I do not think that government has a significant mission and goal and charter, honestly, to fund those fund nonprofits. I believe in that wholeheartedly, but I do always like to find additional revenue streams. And one of the ways that you can find an additional revenue stream is by incentivizing giving. So it's giving to endowments. It can be large dollar, it can be low dollar, but any type of gift, you'll get a tax credit on your taxes. So again, it's just another way of figuring out getting money into the pockets of groups that very much need it in our state.
Well, you mentioned Governor Rauner, and I wonder if you could maybe give us kind of a bigger picture perspective on where you think Illinois is, particularly fiscally. I mean, there's obviously been a number of credit upgrades, and the state seems to be in much better shape financially. There are some who argue, a lot of this is still kind of the residual from federal funds from COVID. The state is on a little bit of a sugar high that maybe will not last forever. What is your big picture sense of both the fiscal outlook and just what are the central challenges that the leaders of your generation feel like you need to address for the state?
Yeah, we can't get too comfortable ever, but I'm very excited about where we are right now. I think Governor Pritzker has done an incredible job in leading the state to some financial stability. I don't necessarily disagree that we are in a bit of a sugar high. And I think that there is this desire in the General Assembly, as well as from stakeholders and advocates, and that we want to keep spending. We want to keep allocating new funds. And unfortunately, that's just, we are not going to see the revenues that we did during COVID. We had an increase in sales tax revenues because people were not spending their money on services. People were not spending their money on travel, going to restaurants, hotels. So we were buying a lot more things. And when we buy things, that revenue goes to the state. So we're going to see depreciated revenue, I think, for the next few years. And it's going to be hard for a lot of organizations to realize. We get a lot of asks in the General Assembly for funding, and they're all very important for very important reasons. So I'm hoping that we are able to take a moment, which I work with obviously the House on their budget side, and I think our budgeteers are very aware of the financial cliff that we may be looking at, what our revenue estimates are going to be. And they're taking a pause and they're figuring out, okay, like, what do we have the ability to fund? And that's kind of up to us in the General Assembly. We appropriate funding, we give that authority to spend. And we're taking a hard look at that right now. It may be a rough couple years. I mean, we may be looking at a recession. And I don't want to see us guarantee dollars to groups who are depending on them and then not be able to follow through on that.
Well, in an earlier life, I was a congressional reporter in DC. And the thing that always interested me is what it takes to be an effective legislator. And it was striking that you would see people who have, great resumes, on paper, and, nice people and polished and smart and all, who were relatively ineffectual, whereas others somehow had kind of the instinct for how the legislative process worked and were successful. Let me ask you, you've been in the General Assembly for, several years. I mean, what is sort of the path to being an effective legislator?
I would say, I think there are two things. A local elected, I'll speak from the local elected position, which I think is the most fun. So being a legislator in Springfield, the most important thing is relationships. 100%. Like, if you do not have good relationships, you are not going to pass your bills, because it takes 60 votes to pass your bill. And you need to make sure that people are comfortable asking you questions instead of just ignoring you. So then you can't justify why you need this bill. And to make sure that people aren't, for some reason, have some sort of like vendetta towards you and will just vote against your bill just because. You also want to be able to work with people, because when you file a bill, it's the starting off point, in my opinion. I mean, obviously a bill can come from a group that's worked on it for a while, or a lobbyist or whoever, but when you file that bill, it becomes like public. That's when the opposition comes out. That's when other proponents come out. And you want to be able to engage all those groups and continue to work on a bill to make it the best you can. I mean, I mentioned that with CEJA. Like, when CEJA was filed, that was the starting off point for everyone to come out and tell the advocates what they hated about CEJA and how to make that bill better. And that's how I go at policy making, is being open to change. I also argue that if you're not changing your mind, you have stopped learning. And the idea that I know everything, I have to be a generalist for the most part in my position. I know I don't know everything. So I do rely heavily on others. I rely on my colleagues. I rely on stakeholders to really inform my opinions and help me figure out, okay, how are we gonna do this? The second thing is, you really can't hold grudges. Politics is a game of loyalty, 100%, but I had a very competitive race, for example, where a lot of people I expected to support me did not. I felt there's a lot of negative campaigning, but at the end of the day, I have to work with those people. And if I just cut them off, or if I start doing things to spite them, I'm going to be less effective. And the most important thing that you can do is advocate for your constituency and work for your constituency. So when I do all that up here with all my colleagues or all the other locals, I'm no longer serving my constituency because I won't be able to get anything done. And that's why I do this. Is I love politics, but I love people more. And I do this job because I want to help people and because I love this state and I want to make it the best place I can. So, that's how I think you can be the most effective legislator.
Well, we've talked to a number of state representatives and senators in our various programs. And the one thing that's striking to me is that they oftentimes say that while there's enormous fighting on the high level issues, there is substantial and maybe even surprising collegiality and bipartisanship on maybe narrower issues, more technical issues. Maybe they break down by region, industry. Has that been your experience, that there's probably more cooperation that's occurring than the people of Illinois might assume?
Of course. Yeah. There's always things that are happening in the rooms, conversations. There are things that the other party may say, okay, we're glad you included this in, but we've got to talk against this bill on the floor. For me, I always make a joke with my colleagues. I'm like, either 0 Republicans are going to vote for this bill and we're going to have on my bill and we're going to have a little bit of, discussion and arguments on the floor, or every single Republican is going to vote for my bill. I'm one of those. It's based off my my portfolio. You're either going to love it or you're going to hate it. And recently I did the Pregnancy Expenses Act, which also applies to expenses related to abortion. So I had no support on the Republican side, but literally about 10 minutes later, I passed another bill that talked about some random small thing at technical issue. And it was great. It just flew through. So there is a lot more collaboration. A lot of my bills, you'll see bills on the Illinois General Assembly website that have bipartisan support. Those are the best types of bills. So I do think that there is a misconception. I would also say, I don't know on the federal level anymore, though, if that is a misconception. I do feel like there is a lot of polarization on the federal level. So I can just speak to the locals. And I love getting along with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle.
Well, tell us a little bit more about the 12th district. I mean, for someone who visits Chicago a lot, I can picture it. It's an amazing part of the city. I think you have Wrigley Field in your district, don't you? And so tell us about the district and also how you can kind of get out and meet with people. I mean, you have these big condos, and I know you just looking at your website, you have lots of events. I think you have a wine tasting with a few other colleagues and coming up. And so how do you tell us about the district and how you can kind of get to talk to your constituents and hear what they're thinking?
I joke, I do have a little bit of a bougie district. But I love my district. Yeah, it's on the lakefront. It's on the north side of the Chicago, near North Side. So I've got Oak Street Beach in my district. I've got Peggy Noda Art Museum, Lincoln Park Zoo, the Chicago History Museum, Wrigley Field. I actually just lost, but I still have in the remapping, but I still have part of East Lakeview. I've got Boys Town. So it's an amazing place to live. I have I tend to skew a little bit older in a lot of my population just because of the large amount of condos I have. I have less families. That recently expanded again, though, with the new map. And I've also got a lot of young people. So your recent college grad, I've got a large transient community, I would say, because we have a lot of apartment buildings over in the Old Town area with all the bars and the hospitality, which is great. Also have some of the best restaurants in the world. I've got Alinea in my district. But to your point about meeting people, so it is very important for me that I go to every neighborhood group's committee meeting or community meeting. So we've got a bunch of different, I'm going to say fiefdoms, but I mean that in actually a positive way. I've got a very active community. So you've got the Old Town group, you've got the Lincoln Park group, you've got the East Lakeview neighbors, you've got the Southeast Lakeview neighbors, you've got the West-East, Lakeview neighbors, everyone. And they all have these small geographic areas. And it's just very important that you meet, instead of me going to the doors, I have to go to the auditorium. I have to go to the meeting room. I have to go to the community center, and talk with people and just be a presence there. Also, summer is when Chicago comes alive, as a lot of you know, it's when Illinois comes alive. And I go to a lot of like street festivals. I do the Pride Parade. I call it parade season, memorial parades. You just have to be super active and get in people's face. But it definitely has changed how I think traditional campaigning for me is, when I have to really campaign, I spend a lot of time doing mail. I do a lot of, I had to do streaming and TV and things like that, get into people's homes, just because it is harder during the winter to really like have that face time with voters. But yeah, that's the district. We're incredibly passionate, and we know a lot, I guess, about our area, and we're very proud of it. So we want to make it the best it can be.
Well, we had this past fall, we had Speaker Welch on campus, and I was talking to him offline about, for some reason, about his first campaign, and I think he won by like 100 votes or less. And he was saying that even in that campaign, his first campaign, he had this sense that he just couldn't stop, and that there's always one more event to go to, or one more, series of phone calls to make. And he said that like his opponent had taken a couple of weekends off at the stretch run. And I mean, how do you balance your life between, all these things going on? You could spend, you could be doing this 24/7. You said you have 2 children and a young child and just another life. I mean, how do you balance all of these demands?
Yeah, and it's hard too, because as a politician, we meet voters outside of working hours. So it's not like this is not a 9-to-5 job because everyone else is working from 9 to 5. I can't just go into your place of employment and sit down at your desk and have a chat. So a lot of my events are in the evening. A lot of my events are on the weekend. So one thing I do personally, I'm going to have a 3rd kid in August. It's a little bit crazy. But I do tend to take my kids to a lot of these events. I think it's important that people see that I'm a working mom, and that they're able to see my family out with me, and know that, sometimes I'm going to come to your event for 30 minutes or 45 minutes, but my child also might have a tantrum. So I have to leave because it's better for everyone. But I showed up, and why I showed up. And sometimes I'm not going to always have childcare. I think that representation again is really important. I brought my daughter 2 weeks ago down to the House floor, and she spent the entire time with me, because I wanted to give my husband a break from having 2 kiddos, and I'm gone a lot of the time in Springfield for half the year. And I think that's important. Like I may not know everyone that I interact with or who's up in the gallery in the General Assembly on the floor, but they see a young woman with a kid, and I want to make sure there's no stigma associated with that. So I've tried to make sure I bring my children places. They also see things, they help out. My son just did a Easter egg hunt with the police district in our area. But I also have limits. I don't do things on like Sunday evenings. I try to set boundaries. I try to really assess the importance of going to certain events. When you're campaigning though, it's totally different. When you're campaigning, when I'm campaigning, I'm probably finding the babysitter. I'm calling my parents. I'm getting out there constantly. I'm getting a hole in my shoes because I'm everywhere. And there's no slowing down because I've got people relying on me who believed in me, who gave me money. And I got to make sure that I'm out there for them and that I win that race. So to that point about Speaker Welch, I think he does a really great job campaigning and knows when to turn it on. And then the other side of him is also he's an incredibly amazing father and husband. And he also knows when he's got to make sure that he's home hanging out with his kids.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you finally for the students who are watching here, and maybe some who think, gosh, this is a career I'd like to pursue.
Oh, no.
How do you start? Well, give them some advice. Should they go into investment banking, or should they professional football?
It depends how much student loans you have.
Pardon me?
If you want to go into this career, you have to be really comfortable being uncomfortable. You have to be okay with like just throwing yourself into a situation. You can't be a wallflower anymore. As a former staffer, I loved being a wallflower and just watching everyone. Can't do that anymore. So I would say start now, putting yourself in uncomfortable situations, like going to that event without a friend, right? Like everyone hates that, going somewhere to a meeting or something without someone that you know. Go volunteer on a local campaign and knock doors, or like go up to voters. If that's what you want to do, you should start getting to the point where you understand campaign infrastructure, but you're also a very social and easygoing person, because unfortunately with politics, like you can be very, very smart. And I want like incredibly smart and knowledgeable people in these roles, but people also have to be able to connect with you and want to vote for you. So that requires this kind of the relationship building I mentioned.
Well, just the final question, in terms of just political figures I've observed, I mean, there's some that are clearly always thinking about the next challenge, the next race, the next office. I mean, it's very, very clear and transparent. Others are of the school that just throw yourself into what you're doing now, and opportunities will present themselves later on. Those are two extremes, and maybe life is more of a middle ground. But how do you view that? I mean, as you look forward, could you envision running for federal office or a statewide office?
I think 100%, but politics is all about timing, right? So, who is going to decide to leave and resign? I mean, it's all your decisions as a politician and what office you run for are always based off other people. So is a statewide elected going to decide that they want to step down, or are they going to run for Dick Durbin's seat? Is there a clear pathway for or not? Sometimes you always feel like you want a clear pathway, but you're never going to get a clear path. Is there an opening for the type of constituency that you represent or the issues that you care about? I think that it's always good to play in between there. I love my job. I do my job because I actually really love policy, and I love being a state rep. It's one of the reasons I didn't run for alderman in my area when that recently came up, because I want my pothole fixed, but I really don't want to deal with all my constituents who also want all their potholes fixed and like their trash picked up. I'm like, definitely a needed government service, but like not my jam. But if there were something that comes up, you should be prepared for that. So don't be transactional or anything like that. But, should I be making sure that I'm talking to people outside my district? Well, yeah, but that also makes me a better policymaker at the state level, because every time I vote, I'm not just voting for the people in Lincoln Park. I'm voting for the people down in Carbondale. I'm voting for the people down in Cairo. I'm voting for the people down in Metro East, because that policy impacts all of them. So having a vast knowledge of what's going on in the state, or expanding the group of people that you're talking to, is always important. It also benefits you when you decide to put your name on the ballot, though, and people are going to vote for you.
All right. Well, Representative, thank you for just an amazingly interesting and fun conversation. And if you ever want to stray down to Southern Illinois, I know you go down to Springfield a lot, but I know you have small children and a busy life in Chicago. But seriously, at some point in the future, we'd love to host you down here and talk to students. And I'm sure they would find the story of your life and your career really interesting and inspiring. So when time is right, timing is everything.
It's on the list. I promise it's on the list.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much and have a great weekend.
Thank you. Bye.
Great. Thank you. And thanks to all of you for watching this first installment of this new series, Rising Stars of Illinois Politics. We'll have this video on our website in the coming days. Please show it to family and friends. And thank you for supporting us, following us on social media, and keeping the memory of Paul Simon alive and well. Thanks much.